the Designing for the New Norm project was started almost 2 years ago as a grant, first with the Synod of the Pacific, where we did a pilot project in Cascades Presbytery, which is most of Oregon. And as a matter of fact, our two peer practitioner panelists who are with us today are from that presbytery. Then we spread it out, and I worked with all the presbyteries in our synod on this project, and then we launched it for national exposure and inviting you guys to the table. The audience is churches that have less than full-time clergy and are looking at new models for sustainability and moving forward. And also clergy who have less than full-time calls. That particular cohort is ongoing, and Brett Webb Mitchell, who will be with us today, is the one who is their moderator and convener of that group. It is the one group we don't record. As we say in the business, they have Vegas rules. You know, what happens on that Zoom stays in that Zoom. So we can let them be purely honest about what they're up to. With that said, before I introduce each of our speakers, I want to open us with prayer. So let's pray. Creative God, we give thanks that you have blessed us with your image in the way of imagination, and that in so doing, you have invited us to sense out the work of your Holy Spirit among us in ways we wouldn't have dreamed of. In so doing, help us to learn how to be open to futures we couldn't imagine, to ways of being church that didn't occur to us, and to ways of thriving in the midst of the secularization of our culture. Give us a sense of hunger for the new and the hopeful ways of taking our churches and our own ministries. In Christ's name, amen. So like I said, the grant focuses on those who are working on new models. This is 7 in a series of 8. So next week, we promised we'd finish up before Thanksgiving. Next Thursday, we'll be looking at merging churches, merging congregations, both from the spectrum of merging congregations of the same denomination and also a model of merging ecumenically in a town where it makes sense, that sort of thing. I've been excited to see how many people, in addition to coming and being a part of these webinars live, are also checking out our archived versions. And I've put the link both to our schedule and the design of the grant project, as well as if you scroll down on that page that this link takes you to, you'll find all of the archived recordings of the webinars. I normally say that I was going to throw up a poll at this point, but I just realized when I came on, I forgot to design today's poll. So let me ask you, on the issue of Mission Outposts, which is our theme for today, do we have any people either raise your physical hand or put a virtual hand up if you are involved in ministry currently that is about Mission Outposts ministries? Okay, yeah, Brett, and that's why you're here. It is probably the most esoteric of the topics we've done. We've done some that are more commonly understood or historically understood. I was very excited to read about it and study about it. I went on, I thought, you only know what you know. So let's see if we can find out things you don't know. And in Googling around, it's amazing what you can find. I, for instance, found there are many definitions of Mission Outpost ministries. And I found some that I would not want to send you to. I found that there's a big Mission Outpost ministry that is designed towards converting gays. It's churches that are trying to create a safe place to tell people that the sinful gayness that they have can be wiped away. I would not be the person that would send you there. I have found Mission Outposts that have to do with, like the ones we are including, is the notion of the way I describe it is where mission is the thrust of the ministry and worship might be the side dish in some versions, but it has to do with being focused on the mission. And I kind of like it because it's sort of going back to understanding that worship was where the people of God created to lean into the celebration of the work they've been doing the rest of the week, that is ministry and mission, and then coming back and joining and celebrating that together. There are some who understand Mission Outposts as sort of a hub of the wheel and spokes that go out, so that there are some designs where you have a center, perhaps large, healthy church that sponsors and underwrites or even trains for and populates mission outposts that do different things. There are a few of them that are kind of fun that focus on different versions of social justice as we go on. But I brought two people on today to share with us for about 10 or 15 minutes about their experience with what they would now call mission outposts. A lot of this is naming things we've done before, but we're putting in new categories. And the two people that I've invited from Cascades Presbytery, which is mostly Oregon for us Presbyterians, are Brian Heron, who is an executive with Cascades Presbytery, presbyter in charge of mission and vision, and Brett Webb Mitchell. And Brett is a pastor in the presbytery with a history on the East Coast of going to my alma mater at Duke and teaching on the Duke faculty. He unfortunately has some connections with Chapel Hill, but we'll overlook that. And he's focused a lot of his work on pilgrimage ministry nowadays, and is becoming quite the go-to guy in a lot of that. And I'm expecting any day now a Church of the Dragon Boat, if it doesn't already exist in his life. So we're asking them to share their stories. Brian has experience with several different examples of this. One that I think is rather exciting along the Oregon coast that he's going to share with us. So with that, Brian, I'm going to ask you to start and share with us a little bit of what you have been doing in Cascades Presbytery and other parts of your ministry that qualify as mission outposts, and how you all understand them in your area.
Great, thanks, Deborah. Yeah, I'll start with basically why I found myself in this position. It really goes back to my experience in college. I was raised in the church, and all my good friends were in the church. But after I went to college, I was like the only one who continued on in the church. And most of my friends left the church. And I found myself living in these two worlds. And so when I think about a mission outpost, part of it has to do with how do I reach my friends and those people that they represent, who probably need something different in terms of the form if they're going to be part of this broader thing that we call church. So that's really driven a lot of what I do. I do want to share three different examples in our presbytery that I think would qualify as mission outposts right now. One is called Tabor Space, and actually it's been in existence for about 14 or 15 years, and it's sort of in this central northeast part of Portland, so part of the urban part of Portland. And Tabor Space is part of Mount Tabor Presbyterian Church, which is this absolutely beautiful, massive Gothic structure that takes up a full block. It's a $9 million piece of property, and it's now being managed by a congregation of 49 people. And this literally has like 30 rooms, a big, beautiful sanctuary. There's quite a bit of land actually on that particular block, but being managed by this congregation right now. And under the leadership of Carly Friesen, they started something called Tabor Space, and where it was initiated was from two things. One, that when the church was first founded, I think 100 and some years ago, it was really just considered a community center. Everybody pretty much was Christian in the area, so it was just kind of where everybody went. They really thought of it as a community center. And then the demographics of the neighborhood shifted. This is kind of we're at the heart of the spiritual but not religious, secular Pacific Northwest. And so as the church began to contend with that, and going back to their tradition of being the community center, they reached out to the community and said, how could we become that community center again for the neighborhood? And essentially what they did is they just invited in leaders from the neighborhood and let them basically try to shape what that would look like. And that's where Tabor Space, the idea of Tabor Space came up. And I'm going to share my screen here. So can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So before the pandemic, Tabor space averaged 2,500 people per week coming through the building. So you've got this congregation of 50 who are the Presbyterians in the church, and then these 2,500 people from the neighborhood. And this is just a picture of what one day looks like in Tabor space. So you can just see 8:30 in the morning, it starts with music together, aging advisors, tiny talkers, public and annex collaborative arts, other music movement, signing, sonic tonic, you write your story, number of things. So this is the activity that's going on in Tabor space, which is one half of the building. I'm going to stop sharing that. So it's been highly successful, but I also want to let you know the barrier that's got in the way to this being as successful as it could be. And here's what's happening. The leadership is essentially split. There's about a third of the folks in leadership who are saying, oh, this is the future of this church. And we need to figure out how to turn that over in terms of the structure of it so that the community can truly take this over when that last group of 89 folks are not there. And then there's about 2/3 of the leadership who are trying to figure out how do we funnel those 2,500 people into our worship, into our traditional curriculums, traditional community, and into membership. And they have struggled with that for about 12 years. And they're still trying to work their way through that. So it's been highly successful in many ways. It really is a community center. They have a coffee shop. They have jazz, at night. It's a beautiful facility, but they're still working through how can this truly become a mission outpost, and they're wrestling with kind of internally wrestling with themselves with that right now. And I'm sharing that with you because we're working on these new models, but there are barriers to that in terms of how we work our way through that. The second one is Calvary Presbyterian Church, and Calvary is a redevelopment project in our presbytery, and they've been working on this for a couple of years, and they're now working with an organization called Recovery Cafe. And what they're imagining is that the Recovery Cafe, which is around recovery for basically alcohol, drug and alcohol addiction, but more than just a treatment program, it's actually a community. It's more set up like a church in the sense that the people who come into it are part of the leadership. They're part of actually running it, and they actually make a commitment, just like a member would. They have to sign up for a certain period of time that we are committed to this community during this time. And what they're using the Recovery Cafe for is sort of the hub. There's an African American congregation in the building, a Hispanic congregation in the building, as well as the traditional Calvary congregation that I believe is down to about 35 members right now, mostly 70s, 80s, and 90s in terms of their age. And this church is actually being very intentional that this is a mission outpost and legacy. And I want to tell you how they got there. This is more in terms of when you think about multiple churches, the pastor, Joan Miller, was serving halftime at Calvary and halftime at another church. And when I looked at the two churches, I felt like we had an opportunity. If she shifted to full-time at Calvary, it would force a conversation at the other church that they needed to have about their future. But Calvary had a real redevelopment opportunity because of it's located on this intersection where there's 5 different roads all coming in at the same time. It's really a central place. And so when she made the decision to go full-time at Calvary with their support, and then not continue at the other church almost immediately went into the conversation around closing. And then Calvary is now in redevelopment. And I share that because when we have each church in kind of a silo, everybody wants to survive, then we get into a place where neither of the churches have a real hopeful future. But by shifting resources to one, we have a real opportunity here for redevelopment. And the last one is the Oregon Coast Trail Pilgrimage Project, and Brett is involved with that with me as well. where that came from, there's two things that came together. One, when I started the position, I recognized that we were going to have church closures in the next 10 or 15 years. That's just going to be part of our narrative. And I was looking at the churches on the coast. We have 15 churches on the coast, and it was fairly easy to project that if nothing changed, maybe 7 or 8 of those churches would close in a 10 or 15 year period. At the same time, there's what's called the Oregon Coast Trail Action Plan, which is an action plan that has endorsement by the Oregon Governor's Office, and it includes about 40 different organizations, Native American organizations, county commissioners, mayors, Travel Oregon, Oregon Parks and Rec. It's a big, giant organization. They're working to finish the Oregon Coast Trail. And that's where I began to think about the possibility that we have the opportunity of putting the infrastructure in place for hospitality, very much like the Camino de Santiago with the albergues. So I connected with our ecumenical partners, and we basically did a map and discovered we have 67 churches in our ecumenical network. And over a 20-year period, you could project that 20, 30 of those may face closure. And could we then, rather than repurposing a church at a time, could we have a model where we begin to repurpose churches over a 10-year period and create the hospitality network along the coast? And what it fits into in terms of continuing the mission of the church is it ties into kind of an ancient tradition that we have in some ways forgotten, that religious pilgrimages they're part of our tradition. And so if we're in a place where we need to repurpose churches, rather than just turning it over to developers for single family housing or whatnot, can the churches actually serve as a place where we can continue our religious tradition and our religious community and the mission of the church just in a new way? So Deborah, that's my 3, and I'll make sure that Brett has plenty of time.
Great. That's great. I can't wait to walk that Oregon Coast Trail. I walked the Camino when I was 19 years old. And,
wow.
And I love the idea that you've got one you're putting together up there for me, and then maybe we can get our California people lined up to do something similar down through Redwoods, Presbyterian, et cetera stuff. Thank you so much for sharing. And I already have a dozen questions for you, but let's go to Brett and hear what he has to say. And then, as I said in the chat, if you all have questions on any of the story pieces you're hearing, put them in the chat and we'll go through them, work them through after we hear from Brett. Brett is, you're on mute.
So as Brian and Deborah said, I'm with the Presbytery of the Cascades. As some of you who are on here today know, I'm also part-time serving on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, a Lutheran congregation, Portsmouth Trinity Lutheran Church. And in the afternoon, I lead a 1001 New Worshiping Community, community of pilgrims. Both communities are doing new and exciting things in very different ways, but so it's been fun to try to balance both of those congregations in my life and keep their hopes and dreams alive as part of their congregations. I'll begin with the Presbyterian part of my life. We began Community of Pilgrims 5 years ago as a new worshiping community. And I had served 12 churches as interim pastor or assistant pastor, and was ready to see if I could find another church, as I needed to stay in Portland because my mother was both living in as well as entering a process in which she was dying. And so I needed to stay in the area. The Presbytery at that time, there were no churches for me to make a move towards as an out-gate Presbyterian pastor. So the Presbytery executive at that time, Hugh Anderson, said, "Why don't you start a new church?" So we began Community of Pilgrims, not as another worshiping Presbyterian congregation, but with the intention of beginning as an intentional Christian community. And that was a difference because I had experiences in L'Arche in Camp Hill, in Catholic Workers House, in Benedictine communities, Koinonia Farms, Camp Hill, and had done my PhD, in fact, looking at community life by participating in a large community for over a year and doing a qualitative research study. So I was very excited about the possibility of doing something new, and that is to gather friends together and other people over the last 5 years who are interested in creating an intentional community, Christian community. So what does that mean, and how does that look for us? This last Sunday was All Saints' Day. We spent the first 40 minutes gathered together, sharing stories about those saints who are no longer with us, by people just checking in. So every Sunday when we gather together, Zoom as well as at a physical church, we begin with checking in. I always found it was interesting as a pastor at a worshiping congregation, the checking in always happened after worship. We always begin with a gathering together of people checking in. And during the period of the pandemic, that was one of the most helpful things. And this is what I've heard from the folks who are part of the community, was we got to check in and we got to see each other every week, because that was the lifeline for many of these people. It was okay that we would have a devotion and things like that, but the most central part of our gathering during the pandemic was having a community of friends that we could check in with, talking about spiritual needs, physical needs, medical needs, daily life needs. So that's kind of where we've kind of taken an interesting turn from what most people would think of as being church. Is we are an intentional Christian community, much like a Benedictine community. We have worship, we have a gathering, we have a sermon in which there's always feedback right afterwards. Then the other thing that was unique was we took John Calvin at his word, and we have weekly Eucharist. And when we used to meet in person, and now we're meeting again, we actually invite people then off the streets. When we were in Southeast Portland, which is a more downtown part of Portland, we would invite people off the city benches to come on in and have a meal with us. We tried before worship, but they would always come for the meal. So it's been interesting for us to go ahead and cast ourselves as a intentional Christian community that has worship, that has prayer, that has service and fellowship, that has education and discipleship as we follow Jesus and embrace all. So we have those things, and we balance them out. In the Benedictine community, the catchphrase is ora et labora et lectio. So ora being worship and prayer, balanced with service and fellowship, balanced with study and devotion to the word. And that kind of balance from the Benedictine community has now become part and parcel of what we do as this intentional Christian community called Community of Pilgrims. And the other thing is, to go with what Brian said, we understand that each one of us are on a pilgrimage. So there is the intentionality, an actual physical pilgrimage of going away, such as on the Camino de Santiago de Compostela, or I just was recently on a honeymoon with my husband, and we went to Fatima for the day. But what I've understood, and what I wrote in this book, Practicing Pilgrimage, is I understand that all of us Christians are on a daily pilgrimage. And so that's kind of been the way that we've set this community of pilgrims together, is we all understand we are on a pilgrimage daily. Not just on just a once a year kind of thing, but daily life is a pilgrimage as we follow Jesus. And that kind of has made it a little different than most Presbyterian congregations that I've been part of. The other part of my life is with a community of Lutherans who, again, each community around 15 to 20 people. Lutherans, well, what we've had to do is a more traditional thing is, as we're in a 100-year-old building, in which we were the Norwegian church, Lutheran Church of Portland. Up until 1941, they didn't speak any English in the church. They were only allowed to speak Norwegian. So it's a very historic church. Again, we were facing a decline in membership as well as pastoral leadership. So because of the covenantal relationship we have with the ELCA, I came on board, and as I said, I did a qualitative research study, ethnographic study for my PhD. And I took all the narrative skills, all the cultural skills, all the cultural adaptative skills I learned on how to do a ethnography. and applied it to this church. And basically what it meant was listening to the community and finding out what the needs of the community are. And we bumped into this. We did an Ash and Dash during Ash Wednesday, in which 15 people stopped by. We had a tent on the public sidewalk, in which 15 people bumped by and said, "Sure, give me ashes and a cup of coffee." Then at the very beginning, we're only a few blocks away from the University of Portland. On the first day of the school year, we opened up a coffee stand, free coffee right there on the sidewalk. We had another 15 to 20 people who stopped by, along with the Dean of Arts and Sciences. And she said to us, and this was key, "You know, there's no place for coffee for students to go to within walking distance of the University of Portland. So when they want to get off campus, they always have to drive." So what that has now done is inspired us to open, every month we have coffee free on the street. And now what we're moving towards is a model of having the students come on in, have a cup of coffee, use our Wi-Fi service, because we believe that this is a way that we can minister to the community, reach out to the community around us, and bring them on in. Because this is the other thing that we've learned in the last few days and indeed years. This new, the Gen Z millennial generation, what they're looking for is authentic community. They're not looking for word and sacrament. They're not, that's not even on their register. They're looking for genuine, transparent communities who are wrestling with justice and issues that confront their daily life. My friend, now retired, John Reuterhair, a Lutheran minister, he's on the board with Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary in Berkeley. And they just had a meeting, and what they've learned is A, the majority of those who are graduating today from seminary are not going into the ministry. B, the other thing that they've learned is this: most people are not looking for a community of word and sacrament. What they're looking for instead is an authentic experience of community that meets the needs of those in terms of justice and in terms of transparency. So I think that what both of the communities' experiences that I've had are trying to do those very same things. And I think that we need to listen to that, especially after this last election, in which we found out that regardless of your persuasion politically, the boomer and Gen Xers, that generation are waning. The new generation that's coming into play are the Gen Z and the millennial class. They're starting to determine elections, and they're going to determine what church looks like in the 21st century. So I think it's really important for us to listen to. Deborah and Jim sent me off to a gathering at the Presbyterian Foundation last week, in which I met other 1001 New Worshiping Communities leaders, and all of them were doing things that started to meet not in a church, but started to meet in a wine shop, in a restaurant, underneath a canopy pavilion in the middle of a city park on an Easter Sunday. And so it was interesting to see and hear what the future is, and where things are starting to kind of bubble up anew is not in your traditional brick and mortar church, but truly is in the community somewhere that's is removed from the brick and mortar church itself, but we're a gathering of people who are sincere, authentic about their desire to be in community with one another is taking off.
Thank you. There's so many, as you can see, different models that really do sort of tap our imagination. And I referred to the gift of imagination in my prayer, and my research work at Duke was about imagination as the image of God in us. And I truly believe that that's how we sense the Holy Spirit, is through that gift of imagination. And I truly believe that it's at its best when it's a corporate experience of it. I have a few questions I want to start off, and then we've got some good ones in the chat. Feel free to add some others. Brian, this one actually was in the chat, but it was one that I had that triggered me when you were talking about, especially the Tabor space. Is that still functioning as a worshiping community also? Do they have a space that is Sunday worship, or is it entirely sort of given over to community activity? And if so, did you meet with any resistance of sort of doing what I said, what I build the sort of mission outpost approach as, of seeing worship as a side dish?
Yeah, so the first question, the building actually is kind of separated into two pieces. So the one side is Tabor space, but the other side still has a functioning worshiping community. They've been very faithful over the years. They're getting smaller, but they continue to have the other side that has the traditional sanctuary, offices, a couple of meeting places. And there was an attempt to bridge those before the pandemic. They also had a coffee house worship that was about the same size as the regular worship service. It was much more informal. It was actually in the coffee house, people sitting around tables, having coffee and conversations. Just a more, it was still, there's some traditional aspects to it, but a much more informal and conversational approach to that. The second question, you mean about that particular church?
No, in general, did the presbytery, you rightfully sort of said culturally, we Northwest Coast folks were the birthplace of at least sort of being crowned the birthplace of the spiritual but not religious, which was a movement and a concept that was rejected openly by other parts of the country. When I first started my work in PneuMatrix, I had people said, don't bring any of that stuff in here. We got to drive that away. Whereas, I'm facing my 45th ordination anniversary, and I thought I was birthed ordained wise into that ministry here because of what the culture was around me in San Francisco. And so did your presbytery sort of have that view already and was ready to embrace the nature of all the different ways in which spiritual but not religious could play out that didn't fit our old pictures of Sunday morning centric worship?
Yeah, I'd be interested in how Brett also answered this, but I'll tell you my perspective. I'm finding an openness to it. But one of the things I'm also finding is that it feels fairly safe as long as it's in the work of the new ministries team. And so there's pockets where it's like, oh, that's so great, we're doing that. But actually to get it really integrated into the life of the presbytery, I am finding resistance, and I do hear comments of like, well, that's really great that's going on, but what does that have to do with church? Or I could still feel in a lot of the conversations that there's still an image of what church should look like. So yes, openness to it, but as long as it's safe, is what I'd say.
I heard you both tell stories that hit that note in me of people thinking, well, we're doing this really, so don't tell me, but we can grow and our membership will increase. And you're talking about the struggling for 12 years of the ministry in Oregon that you're sharing with us. If that's an overt reason, I mean, I often run into churches who are saying, well, we will do this, but it's like in the old days, it was, we will do a nursery school, so we'll get kids. Families often have nothing to do with the church. It's a similar play out of that. Yeah. And if the drive is to say membership, which in their mind also says pledges, which it means says people who will take the leadership baton. It's that whole sort of succession planning in their head of how they want to survive in a way that is still an old model, as opposed to looking and saying, what the heck does membership mean? Membership, it means, in my mind, if you're looking at the way of Jesus walked in ways that attracted authenticity and belonging. It takes me back to the Diana Butler Bass wisdom of the old model of church, and how you entered a church community was believe, behave, belong. The new model is belong, behave, believe. And it says, no, we're incubating a space for authentic belonging and authentic being. And in the midst of that, we are letting you know why we are and who we are because of our faith in that, but not having a sense of the right trajectory like our old church plants, if you will, where we'll give you 3 to 5 years to get to point X, with your people, and then you need to be able to check boxes accordingly. Brett, what's your perspective on that, of the notion of that? I thought it was fascinating. You talked about the check-in was the vital thing, and that you're right. We sort of do it in a coffee hour version of after the fact in most
right.
It became more
it was far more purposeful, and what people started to really depend upon. As I said, it went on for 40 minutes this last time, and it keeps on extending our time together, and I've allowed it to do that. The other thing that's also grew, and this is always an indicator of how people are feeling about a worshiping community, is our list of prayers in terms of concerns as well as celebrations got longer and longer and longer and longer.
Mm.
When people are feeling that they can be more vulnerable and intimate with each other, our prayer concerns and our list of thanksgivings can grow and grow and grow. Now, sometimes that can also be used for political advantage within a community of faith. But in this case, I monitor that and watch that carefully, as does the steering team. These really are sincere expressions of we'd like to have this prayer heard, and people are following exactly when has that prayer request been, I hate to say this, but delivered on, or where is that person in terms of illness or celebration or things like that. So there's not only a blanket sharing of those things, but a follow-up as well. So that's what's been unique.
That's important. I want to share a couple of other models that I've looked at in this. One of our guests in a previous webinar, Katie Stenta, described her church in Albany, New York as, if you'll remember, she was part-time and half-time employed as a pastor of this congregation. They said, we're going all in on you. We've got we can afford you half-time for 2 years, and then we'll probably close. And she said, well, let's recheck in with each other every 6 months. And that was now, I think it's now over 10 years that they've been doing that. And what they did was choose the model of best and highest use of their facilities, much as you were talking about, like Tabor Place would be, of saying what is needed in the community, going deep on the needs of the community. In this community, as in many of our communities, it's some kind of community center or collection of nonprofit services all in one place, where it's better for the recipient of those service needs and for the providers. And then they worked a situation out with the town where she is part-time employed as a pastor and part-time employed as the community director. And it's seamless. And it's the church being filled with the services it needs to be in partnership with, in their case, government and nonprofits as well. There's another model that's in the East Bay near where I live, over at First Hayward, which was a church that was on the cusp, trying to figure out as they were aging out what to do next. And they decided to take in and be an intentional incubation space, a hub, if you will, of mission outposts. So there were a handful at one time. I think at one point there were 4 new worshiping community folks whose teams were planted under the umbrella of the First Church Hayward. And one was in social justice ministries. Each one of them was reaching out to an aspect of the community that wasn't going to be reached by saying, well, get up on a Sunday morning and come worship with us, and then we'll talk. It was saying, we are going to find you. We are going to serve you. And one was, it was advocacy and social justice work, at the same time hooking those people that were doing the protesting and this was in Oakland area, with the services that they needed. In another one, it was a prayer community, a group that was very curious about the notion of pursuing prayer in an ecumenical and interfaith context. I personally have been part of a group of women, a prayer group for almost 30 years that it has Buddhists in it, and it has Jews in it, and it has Protestants and Roman Catholics all together, and we pray together religiously, I'll say, because that's the word people would normally use. But the notion of the hub and the outpost, the hub that offers the sort of cohesiveness of, we are standing with you, we are holding you up in this, and at the same time, you are multiplying us in our ministry. And that's a possibility for so many of our churches that find themselves out in the middle of nowhere in a secular environment where they've lost a generation or two of younger generations of folks, is to find what those needs are. Let those the 2 younger generations begin to develop what their version of worship and faith is going to look like. We have some questions that I think are great because they're getting down to the bricks and mortar issues, the questions of upkeep. Anita asked an early question. I think this was probably while Brian was talking about who pays for building upkeep and expenses. How are things getting paid for? Are these churches that had endowments? Are they being supported in part by the groups that are using them? Like if there's a coffee house that generates income or things like that, or are there presbytery funds that support them? Can I get a sense from either or both of you about that?
Yeah, this is all about kind of a handoff and transition. For most of these models, the church is currently handling, the economic side of this, handling repairs and whatnot. But the concern is where they're going to be in 5 years, 7 years down the road. And this is one of the reasons I'm encouraging churches not to wait too long. If they hit the place where they only have 2 years left, there's not enough energy to do the kind of work that would be necessary to turn this over to the community. The big thing around the economics is that if you don't want to get to the place where you simply sell the building, that you've got to make sure to nurture the community support, and whether it's organizations or individuals that start coming for the new mission. And that's the thing with Tabor Spaces. There's probably enough interest in the community, but they haven't actually let it go in a way that the community can say, okay, this is how we're going to support this. So yeah,
do they have non-members on their whatever? I mean, other than like session members, they have community members that are on the board of the foundation, and is that all mixed at this point?
No, that's actually part of the issue. They're keeping it very separate. There's the nonprofit that has the community members, and then there's the church that has the congregational members. I do believe the church has a couple of members from I believe the nonprofit, the Tabor Space nonprofit, has a couple members from the church on that particular board as well. But yeah, rather than really blending it to say, okay, we're developing now one community that includes both the traditional members and the 2,500 people coming through. They're still in this place where it's largely separate. But yeah, Anita, I think it's the issue, and this is why I think you're often looking at 5 to 7 years of how do you make that transition so you get the community support, and whatever way that looks. It might be one particular nonprofit that's interested in it. It might be a combination, like the Recovery Cafe looks like right now. The Recovery Cafe will be the hub, but there's also 6 other organizations. And so the work that you have to do to get all of those organizations together, where maybe you end up developing a nonprofit 5 years down the road, and then they take over the ministry, the property.
I think that's so important too. In the 12 years I've been working with this arena with PneuMatrix, I have had so many elders and churches tell me, Deborah, it really isn't a lack of money. It's 2 other things. It's a lack of energy and a lack of imagination. And the energy factor is usually because they are aging churches, and they say, 20 years ago, we'd have the people to be doing this. We don't. And that is the notion of don't wait until you're on the cliff as a congregation saying, here's our Hail Mary, is to look and say, what if we could get the vision in partnership with others, perhaps, that have the energy they can bring to the table to do something that, and his attitude, well, I've heard it in different forms from several elders saying, you can find the money. You can find the money in partnerships. You can find it in various ways, but it's really the energy, and he said the imagination, and which is why we think this sort of format is so clever, because we are hopefully seeding the ground with wild and crazy imagination. Those of you who've been to several of these webinars have heard me talk about one of my favorite churches outside of Birmingham that became the dog park church. And the town needed a dog park. Their back acreage was well fenced. They became the dog park for the town, which the town never needed for because it was rural, and now it does. And suddenly, they are that distinctive sort of kind of church that you would never find in a church growth book, but it's worked for them. It's revitalized them in terms of energy and crazy ass imagination, if you ask me. So the notion of being able to be in an environment where we are finding the supportive seeding of imagination, and therefore also looking for the energy is really crucial. David Lyons, you mentioned in the UK, and I'm an Anglophile, so I really like this one, and I lived for a bit over in the UK, and that notion of ancient and newer pilgrimage trails and allowing camping. So Brian, listen up on this one. I don't know if you guys are including hostel capacity or tenting capacity, but camping on the grounds for nominal fee called champing, which I assume is like church camping instead of glamping. And that would be a great add-on for a lot of your folks. Was
So
that a finger going up saying I got something to say, Brett?
Right. One of the pilgrimages I did was taking a group of college students across England. And we went across Hadrian's Wall, which is the narrowest part from Bowness-on-Solway to Newcastle on Tyne. And we hired a camping company. We basically glamped the whole way. And they would always thankfully, they would always find a place for us to glamp for the night by a pub. So we were saved from that need for a true good English stout. But that really worked in terms of doing that. The other thing, to go back to the economics, there is within the Presbyterian Church, the 1001 New Worshiping Community still that has the funds and makes it possible. The issue is always imagination. The other issue, as you said, I think, is the courage to change and to realize where the limits are and do that soon enough in order to make the changes possible. So,
and what's key there is that I find an awful lot of churches that are in that sort of a long period of decline and don't have the imagination, and in some cases not the energy. They're looking, they're saying, well, that new worshiping community, that's not for older churches. And you said, au contraire, it's the notion of using what exists and thinking of it in a different way and applying it. And that's especially the nature of mission outposting, is saying this is who we are as a hub, but this is what we are going to be in terms of our outreach ministry. What were you gonna say, Brett?
In the Greater Atlanta Presbytery, they actually have a person who's hired to follow the new 1001 New Worshiping Communities. And her responsibility is to be sure that they're up and running, kind of thing, and just to keep on. They have 8 or 9 or 10 different new worshiping communities in the Greater Atlanta area. And what one of the things that they've discovered is that they're starting new worshiping communities in old buildings.
Yeah.
In which those who once were there are no longer there, and now the property is open and available, and that's where people are suddenly diving in. The other thing just to remember is we like the Lutherans and the UCC, we're going to run low on pastors really soon, because those who are graduating don't want to become pastors of worshiping communities. They want to do the new and the different and be social action agents in the community. So I think that's our future as well.
Okay. Thank you. There's another question. Anita came back saying, have Brian share more about the economics. He's put an answer in the chat that begins that. And that 10,000 that you mentioned in your chat response, Brian, could be parts that then is attached to new worshiping community funding, which is over, if it's marches forward well, over a 3-year period of helping to seed whatever's going on. I don't know if it is in your case, but I think that there's a possibility for growth there. Delia, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, Delia, asked the question, where do you start looking for organizations or individuals that may want to use your space? Who do you contact first, and how do you get the ball rolling? I will tell you from my perspective, like the Dog Park Church, I as I tell every church, I said, there's a small enough area that probably personally someone who sits on the town council or whatever structure you have, or someone who knows what's going on in the community. It could be a nonprofit leader or something like that. Take them out to coffee, sit down and start talking about, we want to look for best and highest uses of not only our building, but our talents to be able to welcome and help incubate whatever the needs of the community are in ways that we can do that. And you'll get them. And the dog park one, the answer was, the mayor said, I can't think of a damn thing you guys could do to help us, because my biggest headache right now is a dog park. And boom, he didn't have the imagination to see that somebody's back lot could be the dog park at a church, but he spoke it, and there it was. And I think that to be able to pull out from them, what are the things that are most important that you're looking for? they might not have the expectation that churches would be in a position to help in certain situations. We have such perverse views of what churches are and aren't out there in the secular world that they don't always know that we could think creatively outside of their boxes to find ways of doing things. Anybody else want to weigh in on that, on where you start, Brian or
Yeah,
Brett or whatever, on
because I feel for the most part it's really a local answer. So the broad answer has to do with who are the people around the church or with this church who have an investment in that. So when I think about Tabor Space, it was the actual neighborhood around the church. I did a project in Northeast Portland 15 years ago, and it was kind of the whole northeast section of Portland. It's a big region of about 40% of Portland, but it was developing partnerships in that particular region. And then Calvary Church, that's doing the Recovery Cafe. They've been meeting with the neighborhood associations, people, affordable housing folks that may have an interest in the property. But I think the thing is, who are the people who have an investment? And it could be city leaders, it could be nonprofit, it could be the neighbors. It's not going to look the same in every situation. But yeah, who has a stake in that particular property and the mission?
Well,
and I think, go ahead.
Oh, the beauty for me with so Portsmouth Avenue is it's a major avenue, and that's why when we did the Ash and Dash and decided to have a cup of coffee in the morning on the first day that the students said we're coming back, I went out and I sat one day and counted how many people were passing by the church. And there was I mean, we see the studies that are done with black wires going across highways just to count how many cars, but I started to count how many people were going by the church and what were the population just for one day. And the majority were young, they were college students, and that's why I think for Portsmouth Trinity Lutheran Church, the idea of opening up for coffee is going to be a hit because of the population who go by the church naturally any day. And to start off with free coffee for students in the morning, I mean, it's a gold mine. So I think that it's a matter of getting to know your community, doing the kind of investigative work, as you were saying, Deborah, to kind of figure out, not only to talk to the poobahs in the community, but also just kind of sit outside your church and kind of look and see who's going by, getting to know the geographical area, the cultural, and not only the geographical, but also the culture of the area. Around University of Portland, we have bars, we have cannabis stores, but we didn't have any coffee shops. So I think that's why we're going to follow a model much like Mount Tabor in terms of opening up that space and seeing what happens. And my hunch is it's going to take off.
Yeah, I think if any of you are in presbyteries that have access, subscription or whatever, and some of them are Synod based, to Mission Insight, I always work with my churches to take a deep dive into what is that 3-mile radius around the address of the church of what's going on there. Because another phenomenon that is happening in many of our churches is that many of our churches, the membership doesn't and no longer lives in that 3-mile radius. That was their starter church, if you will, but they're so emotionally tied to that church that when they had kids and bought or moved outside the area, they still come back into that area. And what happens is they've lost touch with the actual community. So doing the community walks, I often encourage folks to do a walk on a Sunday morning and see what are you competing with, what else is going on Sunday morning out there, because we're so Sunday centric in our thinking that we don't see what we don't see. So that's another one. Let me roll through and see if I've got some other questions to ask. I may have covered most of them. Right about the economic organization do thing. Can you all imagine if you are serving a place, or if you're a adjudicatory person or something, and are thinking in terms of where could I spark imagination among my people? Do you have ideas? That I always sort of bill it as quite literally crazy ass ways the Holy Spirit might want to be moving around here. And if you put it in that sort of less than holier than thou kind of language, they sort of think, well, I've always thought, why didn't we do this? There's a church in Modesto, California, that realized, much like you described, Brett, is the foot traffic They're across from the biggest high school in the area, and the foot traffic in the morning and at 3 was all these crowds of people. So they decided, let's start doing muffins and yogurt, and they did it
Yep.
free for a while of stuff. And then they were saying, oh well, we're only going to do that during Lent. And said, no, we'll pay for it. Start doing it. So they made an arrangement to be able to do that. And then it was again on the after school side, come hang out here after school, and we've got Wi-Fi. You can do a study hall, you can do whatever. And they just sort of started adapting to the traffic that was around them, which I thought was so important. I think that whether it's by design or default, that notion of opening your eyes and seeing what you don't usually think to look for is an important piece of that. Our churches are necessarily driven to have been Sunday centric and thinking, if we build it, they will come. And that model is so post World War II, it's what worked. And so to have it no longer work is the grief point, the sorrow point of a lot of our churches. And they haven't learned to think outside of that in ways that look to say, how can we find those who it would never occur to them to get up on a Sunday morning and come into something called worship that they've never seen before? And how can we find those portals of entry with them in their lives that say, no, that's not the given, that, these other possibilities are what's there. Or to look at the grand scheme of things of design within a presbytery of a place like our First Hayward does with the various ministries and the landing place and support system for a cluster of new worshiping communities, so that they have their and early on their structure of the pastoral staff of those groups was like, these are my home folks. These are folks where I know I can go and let it all out about what is and isn't working with my ministry, but they're there to support me physically and stuff. And then looking at again the notion of hub and avenues out. I think Mission Outposts is going to be a growing thing. It's an old model in terms of what we now call mega churches, where you have satellite churches, and in their case, it's still usually worship driven. It's still usually the sense of we are the big glamorous sort of hub worshiping community that's thousands, and those outposts are the churches that are elsewhere that are either zooming in or going in to find streaming worship with us. But in this model of Mission Outposts, it's really more the sense of how can we spread our wings and be in places that people aren't going to be in terms of us being church.
The other thing I think
yeah,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I think that, and I see Tom on here, and Tom, I remember some of the conversation Tom added to last time. The future is part-time. The future is being able to put two part-time jobs together, because the future is not going to be full-time ministry. And we have to get, hopefully the students of our seminaries today are starting to hear that. When I was at Princeton graduating in '83, to consider myself doing a tent making ministry I was a failure. Today it's going to be out of necessity, because there are going to be fewer and fewer full-time parishes and more part-time opportunities.
And I will add to that structurally, one of the things that PneuMatrix has worked with even prior to this grant was to lobby on behalf of that model of saying, this is your new norm. And I'd go to Frank Spencer at the Board of Pensions and say, you guys need a new model for making sure that a lot of these folks who have part-time ministries, which often do not offer coverage for any benefits for someone's life, where we can offer a sustainable package. To his credit, I was pushing for a pure cafeteria plan. Plus, I had him cornered once I think it was at a Next Church conference in an elevator just at Tuesday. I said, why the heck do you want to be in the healthcare business? That was sort of, I said, Obamacare had just been born. I said, why do you? And he said, oh no, I need to be in that business. We need to make sure they have good healthcare. We are now at a place where if you are married to someone, you get your healthcare covered through them, and you're in part-time ministry, then it's better for you to say, I'd rather that go into my retirement fund, the money that the church can put forward. The long and short of that is the Board of Pensions now has the minister's choice alternative which is much more flexible, cafeteria oriented, and able to let you paste together pieces of part-time work that will get you the coverage and the benefits that suit you best, even when an individual church may have said, yeah, we went for under 20 hours so we wouldn't have to pay benefits, so to speak. Brian, you had your finger up. You wanted to close with something for us, and then
Yeah, I just want to
Okay.
say, I think we actually have it within our DNA how to do this, but it's a massive shift in how we're thinking.
Yep.
We have done mission for decades and decades and decades, and I think the shift that we need to make, and Deborah talking about the if you build it, they will come. That's a line out of Christendom. You know, when you have a homogenous community of largely Christians around, yeah, if you build the structure, open the doors, those people will come. But my sense is the shift we have to make is that we are now in a mission field. And we know how to do mission. You know, we've supported missions, you know, for decades and decades and decades. But we need to think about how our churches are actually now in a mission field. And if we can make that shift, yeah, I think we've got a fighting chance of this thing.
Yeah, I do too. That's a good note to end on. I thank you all for coming again. Next week is our final in the series, and it's on mergers. And we're going to have a couple of different models, dramatically different models. And as I said, I want you folks that have been involved in mergers to share the good, the bad, and the ugly, because there's a lot of ugly about mergers, even if they end up working. Thanks for being with us, and I'll look for those who are going to join us next Thursday. Bye-bye.